Our next speaker is Dr. Tony Vinn. Dr. Vinn is professor and cropping systems extension specialist with Department of Agronomy at Purdue University. Prior to being at Purdue, he was at the University of Guelph, and before that he was grown up on a hog and cash crop farm near Ridgetown in southwestern Ontario. Currently, Dr. Vinn advises graduate students on research focused on the understanding the interactions between tillage, crop rotation, plant density, and or nutrient placement systems with corn responses and soil properties. So this afternoon, Dr. Vinn is going to teach us about reading corn. So welcome, Dr. Vinn.
Well, it's great to be here, so thank you very much. The last time I spoke in Prince Edward Island was in the late 1980s when I was teaching at the University of Guelph. And at that time, I don't think there was any corn grown on Prince Edward Island. And so because I am a student of corn, and even though I retired a year ago from Purdue University, I still consider myself a student who never grows tired of learning how to improve the efficiency of corn production. So in part because I'm married to corn, not quite as strongly as I'm married to my wife of 50 years, but you know, it competes, you might say. So this is a pleasure to talk about this subject today. The title of Reading Corn Leaves actually came to me from Peter Johnson for a presentation that I had to make a couple of years ago, and Peter has a gift for short titles that attract attention. And so when you talk about reading corn leaves, what do you think of? And one of the people I was talking to today says, well, probably nutrients, and you're not far off when you talk about that. Okay, so here we are. I'm at the end of a career which did a lot of training of graduate students, and the same thing was true for people like Peter Sikkema. And sometimes you have particular graduate students out of the 45 or so that I've trained that leave a special mark. And Ken Janevek was one who became blind when he was a master's student with me, finished his program, and just accomplished a lot, and unfortunately was taken away in June of 2023. So nothing happens in a vacuum when you talk about advancing science. It takes a whole team to get there, and anyone that does science always needs to appreciate that. Don't give credit to me. You can give me credit for anything I say, or you can give me crap for anything I say that's obnoxious, but the credit goes to the team, not to an individual. I'm going to start today by just saying a little bit about plant tissue testing. And the first question I'm going to ask is of the room itself, in the sense of if you're a farmer or if you're an agronomist, how many of you routinely take some tissue sampling? And I wouldn't mind knowing, just from hands raised in this room, how many routinely do some tissue sampling? Okay, so it's not a lot. And then if I were to ask the question, how many routinely do some tissue sampling for something other than potatoes? So there's still a couple of you that do that, so thank you. So when I looked at the Atlantic Canada provinces in terms of what was available online in terms of tissue testing, obviously the biggest one that comes up is from Prince Edward Island for potato tissue testing of the petioles at different growth stages. In Nova Scotia, another example that comes up of tissue sampling guide is from their field crop guide, published in 2010. And this one has a kind of an interesting discussion. So basically, it's got corn, at seedling to 6 leaves, and then it says all of the plant parts when the corn plant is young, and then if you get to the silking stage, the recommendation is that you sample the leaf opposite the corn ear, and for some strange reason, Nova Scotia calls the leaf opposite the ear leaf, and I'm not exactly sure how they come up with it. This is their stylized diagram, and I would encourage those of you that are students in the room to sort of fix this diagram the next time that Nova Scotia publishes something about tissue testing in corn. This is wrong for a couple of reasons. Number one, the ear leaf is the one that actually, where the ear starts. And number two, if you were ever to have 2 ears on a corn plant, they would be on consecutive nodes, not jumping a node and then all of a sudden appearing again. However, having said that, we all have things we need to learn, right? And so I'm going to suggest as well that what's wrong with the tissue sampling guides all across North America, not just in Atlantic Canada, is everything to do with how dated the information actually is. And so Nova Scotia, in their guide, at least goes through, acknowledging, okay, this comes from OMAFR, and if you don't like the OMAFR tissue sampling results, well, you can consult with A&L Laboratories, and lo and behold, from Indiana. And so A&L is one of the strongest soil testing labs in Ontario, Canada. They're based in London there. And so what's wrong with this is basically that this information is at least 30 years old. And so that's why I'm sort of focused on, if we're going to go beyond soil testing to tissue sampling, we've got to have a more reliable indicator than we do today. New Brunswick is another example of having a publication related to plant tissue sampling. And so they've got a more comprehensive list of crops that you can do tissue sampling on. And so they've got everything here from corn to cereals to blueberries, potatoes, tomatoes, etc. But again, I come down to this bottom thing. This bottom thing is basically, where does this information come from? How old is it? It comes out of publications that were made in 2007, and that 2007 public information is probably based on research that was done 40 years ago. And so we don't have current information. And so although we publish these sufficiency ranges, they are suspect, because genetics has changed, management has changed, climate has changed. So where do we go with this? Well, we've got the whole plant sampling, and then we don't really have a published guideline on what farmers should sample if they are between V6 and the VT stage, or just before tassel emergence on corn. But often, if high-yield corn farmers are going to do anything, they're probably going to sample the top fully collared leaf. So in other words, it has to have expanded at least totally. And leaf sufficiency ranges are sometimes associated with grain yield. And then there's this sort of big thing for me is that everything about how we grow corn, including its plant density, certainly its hybrids, and the rest of the fertility management that you've employed that year is going to influence the effectiveness of pulling any individual leaf sample and trying to make a production recommendation as far as whether a foliar spray is still, or foliar fertilizer application is still warranted. And so I'm sort of going to go back a little bit to say, okay, this Ontario guide, and again, it hasn't been updated in 30 years. And John Lozon, who speaks later, he can correct me on that if I misspeak, because actually I've been out of the country for 25 years, so that's so I may have missed something. But in my reading, I couldn't find anything else. So anyway, So we have that, and then because I've had the opportunity to work in Indiana, Indiana relies on a tri-state guide, which is Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio together. And I just thought it would be kind of fun to compare what the sufficiency ranges are for corn when it's sampled at the initial silking time. So here we are at silking time, and I'm going to go across here and just look at what does Ontario say and what does Indiana say. Well, Ontario says that the critical concentration for nitrogen on ear leaf sampled at silking time is 2.5. Indiana says 2.9. What about another nutrient? So we're going to go to potassium. In Indiana, it says we need to have at least 1.9%, and in Ontario, they're very low at 1.2%. What about sulfur? And sulfur is, of course, it was in the Indiana, or in the Island Farmer News, actually this week, in the publication that's available on some of the tables around here. And basically, the recommendation from Ontario is 0.14, and in Indiana is 0.16. So you can see that even there is a little bit of difference. And you have to ask the question, if there are differences, is it because the early maturing corn is fundamentally different? Or is it because this Ontario corn and presumably PEI corn is lower yielding than something that might be grown in Indiana? And so I'm going to talk about some of the things today that are changing in corn and reasons why tissue nutrient concentrations might be affected by the genetics as well as by the management. And I would encourage you to raise some questions with me. But just before doing that, for those of you that are tissue sampling in corn, it's the worst possible job. If I had to choose as an agronomist between tissue sampling in wheat versus potatoes versus soybeans versus corn, the last crop I would pick to do tissue sampling in, certainly at flowering time, would be corn, because you've got height, you've got humidity, you've got pollen, all of that sort of thing, and it's enough to drive anybody crazy. And why would they go into a job where somebody is asking them to do tissue sampling? And so I was involved in a project at Purdue University where we were trying to come up with a robot application in order to do automatic leaf sampling for us. And so this is a GPS-guided machine. It runs up and down the corn rows. It's got a kind of like a heating-type scissor, and it'll collect leaves for you every 200 meters or whatever you want down the row. The only trouble with this robot is it doesn't have a very good steering system on in terms of dealing with end rows on corn when it gets to the end of the field. But you have to trust that in the future, sampling is going to get easier. It hasn't so far, and so and that's one of the reasons why we employ young people. They've got more endurance for those kinds of conditions, right? And so that's a good thing. But in the future, I'm convinced this will not last. If we're going to make this work, we have to figure out a way to automate it, and this is one of the ways that I think has some promise. But fundamentally, everything that I'm going to present today is about that modern corn hybrids are different. Stay green was already mentioned, and so this is no different, and just sort of presenting how late in the grain filling period the 2015 hybrid looks, let's say, compared to a 1958 hybrid. So that's not new information, but it is a factor because for a couple of reasons when it comes to nutrient concentrations in leaves. The first is that corn plants are going to be taking up nutrients longer after the flowering period. And so that begs the question, if you're going to have a longer period of nutrient uptake, does that give you flexibility in terms of the critical concentration at any particular stage of development? Because if you've got the extended window for nutrient uptake, then maybe that gives you some flexibility in terms of the actual critical concentration that you need to have at a particular stage. And plant health obviously figures into this prominently as well. And to deal with the genetic gain side of things, I'm sorry that I'm going to borrow from the last era study that I was involved with, which was of DeKalb hybrids over a 40-year period from 1980 through to 2020. And we planted something like 40 different hybrids representing that 40-year time span. And this was a very large study that was conducted at many locations across the U.S. Corn Belt, going into Michigan and Ohio as well. And the conclusions from that is that we gained at about 2 bushels per acre per year in that 40-year period. And that was true at the 111-day maturity, which is way beyond what you can grow here, as well as at the 103-day maturity, which is more in the northern part of the Corn Belt. I want to talk a little bit about this because the assumption in society is that if something is yielding more, then farmers are going to be inclined to add more nutrients in order to achieve that higher yield. And I think that we don't give genetics enough credit when it comes to efficiencies of nutrient uptake. And so this is where a lot of my research was going in the last several years, which is basically looking at modern hybrids under low nitrogen, and that's shown here in the top part. So basically we had these 40 hybrids representing 40 years of crop improvement for DeKalb. And then we compared that to a high nitrogen situation, and the high nitrogen situation was an average application rate of 230 kilograms per hectare versus 56. So we've got this set up. We've planted these hybrids side by side. It happened to be at the same density in this particular experiment. In other experiments, we adjusted the density for the plant population that would have been used at the time that those hybrids were actually introduced. So the first thing is on yield. And what I want to essentially show is the fact that there is a tremendous yield improvement even under this low nitrogen situation of 56 kilograms per hectare, or around 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen. And that yield gain there is about 88 kilograms per hectare per year. At the high end, it's 102. And 102 kilograms per hectare per year, for those of you that think in bushels per acre, is 1.6 bushels per acre per year from the genetics alone when grown side by side at this particular nitrogen rate. And in terms of the yield range here, I had to do some new math today in terms of tons per, what is it now, tons per acre. Okay, metric tons per acre. It sort of reminds me of when I was spraying as a before I left Guelph, and we had to learn liters per acre, right? And so here we are, we're on the island. Okay, tons per acre. So what does this convert into? What's 12 tons per hectare in terms of tons per acre? Anybody want to venture a guess? 4.8, thank you. And this yield goes up to something like, let's say, 15 and a half tons per hectare. So we're talking just over 6.1, 6.2 tons per acre. So that's the increase that's occurred. This increase that's occurred is at 102 kilograms per hectare per year, which is kind of an amazing thing that's occurred. But what I really wanted to deal with is this nutrient efficiency side of things. We had these two nitrogen rates, and these are the total nitrogen uptake that occurred in these plants. So first of all, at 56, we've got these gray bars down here. We applied 56. The total plant took up somewhere between 150 and 180 kilograms per hectare. So that, you're just dealing with a tremendous efficiency here. 50 kilograms of fertilizer, and you're taking up at least 3 times that at that low end rate. And even at the high-end rate shown over here, basically we're applying 230 and we're taking off somewhere in the neighborhood of 270 to 280 maybe kilograms per hectare. So my point essentially is that this total land uptake is increasing, whether you're starving the plant for nitrogen or whether you're applying it adequate nitrogen. And what that means is that it is not true that you need to be thinking in terms of your nitrogen rate for corn based on how many metric tons per acre you're actually expecting to produce, as long as you are employing the latest high-yielding hybrids, because you can be pretty sure that the latest high-yielding hybrids are also, at the same time, serendipitously, going to be more nitrogen efficient. And that's a good news story that I think we should be saying more often to our neighbors that live in towns and in cities across eastern Canada. The other thing I will say about leaves on corn plants is that this study also found that, first of all, in newer hybrids, we produce leaves faster. We close the canopy faster at let's say, any particular plant density. We have the same total number of leaves per plant, and that's, by the way, is also true for some of the short corn hybrids that Bayer and Corteva and other companies are producing. But the more urgent thing, I think, when it comes to tissue sampling on corn is that there is more overlap now between vegetative growth and reproductive growth. So it used to be that your corn would get to full height, the leaves would be fully expanded, and then you would finally see these stalks come out on the ear. Nowadays, modern corn hybrids are different in the sense that they're still expanding vegetatively those leaves, and at the same time, they're actually producing an early emerging silk, in part because we want to get to this longer grain filling period that Peter talked about this morning already. So the longer grain filling period in part is coming about because on corn we're starting reproductive growth sooner. And then we hope by having improved leaf health that we'll be able to continue filling longer to get to heavier kernels and higher yielding overall situations. But what that means is the fact that if we're in this period and we're sampling the ear leaf even, let's say, right at silking, we've got to recognize that there's an overlap period there, which is occurring because the plant is still expanding its leaves. The second thing I wanted to point out is that the timing of nutrient uptake is very much tied to the stages of development, and this is often a citation that's made in the U.S. from Bender, from Illinois' work, from hybrids around the period of 2010 to 2013, and they looked at the total biomass uptake. The green is the leaves. The orange here is the stalk uptake, and then these are the three nutrients, of the major macronutrients, N, K, and S. And the point I essentially wanted to make here is that by the time we get to this flowering phase, sort of from R1 to R2, when it comes to nitrogen, we've taken up about 65% of the total nitrogen. When it comes to potassium, we've taken up about 85% of the total potassium that's going to go into the plant is in there at that stage. When it comes to sulfur, we're somewhere around 50%. And so during the grain filling period, there's a lot of sulfur uptake that still has to occur. So when it comes to tissue sampling, let's say right around the silking time, you have to sort of recognize where are you on terms of the total plant uptake cycle for that specific nutrient. And that helps, I think, in terms of the interpretation. So when one of the projects that I started at Purdue University and unfortunately ran out of energy on and had to retire was Indiana corn leaf research objectives, and basically said, okay, we know a lot about nitrogen on corn. We don't know so much about other nutrient concentrations in the leaves that are needed to get to high nutrient uptake as well as high yields. And so the question that I essentially tried to say is, okay, what about different leaf positions for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur? How well does any individual leaf on a corn plant relate to the whole plant? Because that's one of the questions. There's two questions when it comes to nutrient concentration. If you're picking an individual leaf, is how representative is that leaf? That's number one, of the whole plant. And then number two, what difference does it make as far as yield is concerned? When you're sampling that leaf at that stage, what in the Samhill does it mean in terms of actual yield performance? And so that's sort of what I started to do, and I decided to look at examples of both mobile nutrients as well as immobile nutrients. And the mobile nutrients, of course, always refers to the nutrients that can move from lower to upper if needed in a corn plant, rather than only relying on new uptake to meet the nutrient needs in the upper part of the canopy. So the ones that are immobile include sulfur. So we'll talk a little bit about that one too today, but we don't have time to talk about all of the other micronutrients that also. And this immobility versus mobility is, I think, something that we need to keep in mind when we think about nutrient sampling. It's definitely the case that when it comes to later stages of sampling in corn, about the only option that you really have is to consider a foliar application of micronutrients. I'm not generally in favor of late applications in terms of after silking, certainly, for something like the macronutrients that are applied. And so this whole question about mobile and immobile is true regardless of what the plant is. It doesn't matter whether you're growing marijuana or growing corn. It's all the same story when it comes to deficiency showing up. I don't grow marijuana or take it, but anyway, I just thought, in that respect, you know, plants are equal, right? So, okay, tissue sampling. So what did we do in this particular project? We essentially just said, okay, we're going to sample individual leaves. And the trouble with doing this in corn is that we lose some of the lower leaves. You can't find them anymore, right? The first little leaf is only a couple inches long, and it dies, browns off pretty quickly. So we did some painting to try to define what leaves we're going to do. The trouble with tissue sampling after V6, when you take the whole plant all the way up to R1, is that you have to decide which leaf you're going to take and how meaningful is that particular leaf. And so what we did is we essentially said at the V8 stage, we're going to take the top fully expanded leaf. So that was the leaf we sampled. At V12, we decided to take V8 again and to go to the 11th or the 12th leaf. That's, again, the one that's fully expanded. At R1, we decided, okay, we'll do 8, we'll do leaf number 11 or 12, and we'll do the year leaf, and we'll do the top leaf, and try to learn from that whether there is any pattern here that we can figure out in terms of judging sufficiency for some of the mobile nutrients as well as some of the immobile nutrients. And I'll tell you the story rather than bore you with the results on all of this. But first of all, this first story is on the top leaf at V8, and this shows here the whole plant nitrogen. So for the first question is, how does an individual leaf relate to the whole plant nutrient status? And here it's not bad for the top leaf at V8, but it's also not bad at the V12 stage for nitrogen. And this is for a situation where we had 4 different rates of nitrogen going from 0 to 215. Then we went to the R1 stage. And so the question was essentially, if we go to R1 and we're trying to determine the nitrogen status, which leaf would tell us the most about the whole plant nitrogen concentration? And so that's shown here. Here we sampled the 8th leaf and the 12th leaf and the ear leaf and the top leaf. Those were the 4 sampling positions, and the one that won out in terms of having the highest correlation with the whole plant status, and this correlation, basically the higher this number, and in the black here, the better the relationship. The one that stood out was basically the 12th leaf at the ear leaf, at the R1 stage. So what this essentially means is that even if all you're interested in is nitrogen, the ear leaf is, well, it tells a decent story in terms of whole plant nitrogen concentration, but a better story could be learned from the 12th leaf, a couple of leaves below the ear leaf. And I should emphasize for this situation that these are for plants that routinely get 20 leaves of corn, and routinely where the ear leaf is leaf number 13 or 14. So the ear leaf is number 13 or 14. So when I say 12 or 11, I'm talking, generally speaking, 2 leaves below the ear leaf. The other question, besides how well does an individual leaf relate to whole plant nutrient status, is how well does that leaf concentration predict grain yield performance. And so here we have results for the 8th leaf shown in blue. And so this is grain yield, and here in this case I'm using bushels per acre again, which is the only language Indiana knows. And then here is the individual leaf nitrogen concentrations. And you know that what we wanted to get to is, we believe the tissue testing publication in Indiana, is we wanted to get to 2.9% nitrogen. So that's all the way over here. And if you compare that to where would we be if we used Nova Scotia results or New Brunswick results, well, that would be right around 2.5% here. And again, these are correlation values, and so which leaf provided the best prediction of a grain yield response? And that happened to be the 11th leaf. So this line here was the line that was most closely related to grain yield. And this is for a grain yield range of 100 bushels to 300 bushels per acre, which is the same thing as saying something between 6 tons and almost 18 tons per acre, per hectare, which is, you guys can do the math on what that means in terms of tons per acre. I'm getting a little bit lost in trying to do that quickly here today. But anyway, this is over a wide range in yield. So that told us that the ear leaf wasn't necessarily the best leaf. The other factor on how good a leaf is in terms of telling a response is what is the plant population of corn? And so here we are, we're sampling the lower leaves, and we're doing that in an experiment where we had 4 different hybrids, and we're planting at plant densities of 20,000 per acre all the way up to 44,000 plants per acre. And then basically we were looking again at relationships with yield. But what I want to do first is basically just point out, okay, if you've got 20,000 plants per acre, the ear leaf concentration here is 2.75. If you go to 26,000, then it's 2.65, and if you go to 32,000, it's 2.5. So what you essentially see is that the higher the plant density, you're going to lose nitrogen concentration when you sample at the ear leaf at the R1 stage. So there is a density impact on the actual nutrient concentration that shows here for the lower leaves. This is when we sampled the leaf at the ear leaf, and the one above and the one below. And here there is less difference in the, I got to go back one. A less difference in the nitrogen concentrations. And so here we're 2.96 on 20,000, 2.94 on 26,000, and 2.86 on 32. So one of the unique things about corn today is that right at silking time, we've got the vegetative growth going on, we've got the ear sending out its shoots, and the ear is starving for nitrogen, and the ear shoot itself is wanting to get to around 5 or 6% nitrogen in order to divide as many cells as possible in order to have endosperm cells to fill with sugar and then starch later on. And so everything about a corn plant at that stage is focused right on the ear leaf and the ear shoot, because it's trying to meet that ear shoot demand for something like 5 or 6% nitrogen initially, and then it goes down in concentration as the kernels get into the linear period of grain fill at the R2 stage. So what this told me essentially is that it doesn't really give you the most representation to sample at the ear leaf. You're probably better to sample at one of the lower leaves if you want to detect a nitrogen status situation that relates to yield. Another nutrient is phosphorus, and here I won't show the individual concentrations except to say that in Indiana we wanted to have 0.3% phosphorus. And the leaf that had the highest relationship to yield was actually the 8th leaf. So this is the leaf that best represented the response to yield in this particular study, not the ear leaf. So what that told me is that on nitrogen, we wanted to have somewhere around the 11th or 12th leaf. On phosphorus, we actually wanted to go even lower in the plant in order to get the most accurate status on terms of yield response. What about for an immobile nutrient like sulfur? So sulfur deficiencies, as was also mentioned in this Island Farmer paper, and the subject of research here as well in Atlantic Canada, is all about how can we improve, how can we spill water on the lectern? That was what sorry. Learned there. So basically, sulfur is kind of a unique story because it's quite common now in states like Indiana to be putting on 10 to 15 pounds per acre of sulfur routinely for corn. And again, we go into this question of, well, if we were to sample the top leaf at V8, would that give us a pretty decent situation in terms of estimating whole plant sulfur? And not bad. The trouble is if we sampled just one leaf at the V12 stage, we had very, very low R-squared values, just 0.17 to 0.24. So what that tells me is that once you get away from V6, V8, trying to go to an individual leaf is not going to work until you get to the R1 stage. And at the R1 stage, then we picked up again, and we had pretty decent relationships with sulfur from almost any of the leaves, including the top leaf, which is what you would expect perhaps to have the highest concentration. But when it comes to taking sulfur concentrations in any individual leaf and relating it to yield, and that's really what drives the expectation here, is which one was the highest correlation? Well, the highest correlation was actually with this top leaf. And so the top leaf is shown here in purple. And so this is the strongest relationship with yield in terms of the nutrient concentrations. So I'm telling you a mixed story. I'm telling you, well, if you're interested, it depends on your nutrient of interest. It might be the top leaf for sulfur at the R1 stage. It might be a couple leaves below the ear for nitrogen, and it might be going all the way down to the 8th leaf when it comes to phosphorus. And so what I'm trying to get at is the fact that we've got very little in the way of research information that is needed to improve the recommendations that we now employ. And so I can see that the hesitancy about trying to go the direction of tissue sampling is, number one, in corn. It's tough to do, especially if you're going to wait until the R1 period. But even if you go earlier, what leaf are you going to take? And so how do I end the story with acknowledging this sort of, the science isn't finished here? And so what I'm going to say is that, first of all, that leaves in modern hybrids are different in many ways. And part of that is genetics, part of that is the density at which we're growing them. And the leaf nutrient sampling, I think, needs to change to current hybrids and production practices. And we need to look at especially the higher plant populations, because we know that they will reduce certain nutrient concentrations, especially in the lower part of the canopy as you approach flowering and grain fill. And it may also change this threshold. So the threshold that we used in Indiana was 2.9% for nitrogen, 0.3 for phosphorus, 1.9% for potassium, but those could change depending on on subsequent research. And if you were to pick a optimal leaf position at R1, it probably can't only be the ear leaf. So here I'm sort of suggesting that, if you're interested in sulfur, well, maybe it's the top leaf. And so then you begin to shake your head and you sort of wonder, well, why are we doing this? And in part, why we're doing this. So we have to back up to why would we tissue sample in the first place? Well, if you were to tissue sample after the V6 stage, you're doing that because you are intending, you can still get over with a high boy, and you can still do a full ear application. So you're dealing perhaps with an immobile nutrient that you'd like to correct. So what are your leaf sampling goals? And for some people, it's all about trying to understand what led to a deficiency symptom in the field. And so here's an application of fertilizer that didn't go wide enough with the bulk spreader. We've got some issues over here, and we're trying to figure out, well, why are those lighter colored patches of corn showing up? Is it sulfur, or is it potassium, or just what is going on there? And so and if you do that, then it's pretty simple. You just take samples from the good area and from the lighter colored area, and you compare those two, and it can give you a clue as to what might be an issue. The dominant use of tissue testing today is by high yield pursuit kind of farmers. So the farmers that are interested in winning yield contests. And what do? They essentially are in their fields every week or every 2 weeks. And certainly in this period between V7 and R1, they're usually sampling the top leaf. What critical level are they using in their analysis? Well, they are using critical levels that often go all the way back to the V6 stage. But the truth is, they really don't have science behind them in terms of what they need to do to achieve. It's helpful for them to be aware of micronutrient deficiencies, but I think it doesn't tell the full story, because these lower leaves are sometimes going to tell them more about nitrogen and potassium and especially phosphorus concentration deficiencies showing up. And then the other factor is how do we use this R1? Is this simply a post-mortem? Are you at the R1 stage? You may be able to get some airplanes in to apply something without draining the bank entirely. But why would you do this? and should it ever replace soil sampling? And my answer to that is soil sampling is still, the most valued, sampling that needs to be done from a plant nutrition perspective. If you do an R1, you may be identifying what your management package did that brought you short from sort of the previously published critical levels, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. And so I think where this needs to go is we need more work on the micronutrient relationships, especially for the immobile ones, and we need to intentionally test corn at various soil levels of P and K and sulfur in order to have many more data points than what I was able to show today. I kind of retired too soon, and I wish that I had been able to keep up the energy level to keep going. But the nutrient concentrations, and the leaf position question is still out there, and I hope that there is an opportunity to go forward with using new technologies, and perhaps in reflectance or automated leaf sampling that can get us better information than we have today. And these are some of the graduate students and companies and government institutions that funded my research at Purdue. So thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Venn. Any questions?
So Tony, can I use, like, the ultimate holy grail is being able to predict the maximum economic rate of nitrogen and now also sulfur, right? About knee-high corn, because it's still pretty easy to add those nutrients.
Right.
Is there an opportunity to use tissue sampling where I would run a check strip of very high rates of those nutrients versus my standard program to evaluate how much I need to bump up my standard program at that time?
Yeah, I think that would be the idea of having a test strip which is intentionally perhaps higher than optimum would be a really good reference point to be able to go into, let's say, V8, V10 corn, and then compare the two for applications in crop of nitrogen and sulfur, especially because they're going to continue to be taken up well after the R1 period. Like 50% of the sulfur goes in after flowering, right? So there's still an opportunity to address that, but where I would go in terms of nitrogen is that I would put a little bit of more emphasis on going perhaps the top leaf if I were interested in sulfur, and maybe I wouldn't use the top leaf if I was interested in optimum nitrogen management. I might go down 2 or 3 leaves from the top fully expanded leaf at that later growth stage.
They're really interesting that corn takes up so much of its sulfur post-anthesis.
Correct.
Wheat is 91% of the sulfur is in the wheat crop by lag leaf stage.
Right.
So our recommendation on wheat is actually really shifting to all the sulfur as early as you can get it on the field.
Correct. Right.
So just quite different. Interesting.
Very different. Right. Yes.
Tony, in around 2000 in Ontario, we had proposed that growers link fungicide application to enhance fertility, particularly nitrogen, and we got tremendous pushback from particularly some seed companies saying that this how in the industry how corn was being grown. Are your trials with tissue and nutrient assessment being done with the fungicides used in companions to the program?
Yeah, so the question was essentially, are we employing foliar fungicides on corn when we're doing these trials with different nutrient concentrations? And the answer is yes. Routinely now we're at least one foliar fungicide application. And in Indiana today, my guess is that probably about 2/3 of the corn acreage receives a fungicide application, whether it's corn after corn or corn after soybeans. And that's important because we've found that the grain filling period on corn in Indiana can be extended sometimes by 4 days or something like that with the additional plant health. And that gives another opportunity for more nitrogen uptake. The nitrogen uptake, though, that occurs that late won't necessarily get in the grain. But it is a way of doing a couple of things. Number one, it's picking up nitrate from the soil that otherwise might be lost, especially if there's no cover crop planted after the corn. And number two, it helps a little bit in keeping a lower CN level in the stover that's left over. And the CN ratio of the stover in corn is changing to the detriment of soybeans that follow, because if you've got a really high CN ratio, that tends to immobilize nitrogen for the soybeans that follow. And so, so I like the idea of continued nitrogen uptake with healthy leaves, and in these trials we're routinely using fungicides. Yeah.
Because I talked with Peter after he presented, and I said to Peter that my first boss did his PhD in Stay Green.
Right.
I'm talking about, and it is interesting on the island. I'm from away, and when I started to talk about Stay Green, whether it be cereals and corn,
right,
I had a tremendous amount of pushback. It's like, well, I'm going to end up harvesting it later, and it's so good today to hear both you and Peter talk about you got to keep the plant green and alive to make.
Right. There's one caution though on well, first of all, I hope you're not getting pushback today, and I hope you've found friends on the island.
Not sure yet.
But in any case, there is a one consideration though that is still important, and that is that when you're limited by the risk of frost, you have to factor in how late a maturity of hybrid you would actually plant if you plan to carry it through to grain. It's different if you're talking silage, but if you're talking grain and you're trying to get to black layer and you're also applying a fungicide that could extend the grain filling period, then that could push you into a low test weight situation if you had a killing frost. And so if fungicide application is part of the management package, do not go to the absolute limit of maturity in your hybrid selection, because there is a consequence in certain years. Yes.
Thank you. I've struggled with that. I accept it, and it's real.
Right.
And the only analogy that I found that growers can relate to is a V8, a V6, and a V4 with turbo.
Okay.
Because we have to downshift the maturity. In the past, we've had crops that died down from disease. That's what
Right.
we saw as normal. But the auto industry's gone that way to maximize efficiency of the system. We take and downshift in terms of the maturity / horsepower.
Okay.
We jack it back up again with a turbo, and corn we jack it back
Right.
up sort of with a fungicide.
Yeah, that's good. By the way, I'm not being paid by Syngenta, so.
Well, I appreciate your comment.
But thank you for this opportunity, and
you.
I'll be around for a while.
Thank you.